The Meai, the Altiovian creation myth, Part 1. The most ancient fragment of Altiovian mythology concerns the creation of their gods, the Meai, the Dirthion, light Meai, and Agroro, dark Meai. The ancient Altiovians believed that in the time between death and the rebirth of the world, a being of immense power resides, called the Meai. They are forever trapped in the agony of never-existence, in the dark void between death and birth, unable neither to live nor die. The Meai was said to have been born in the twilight years of the dying world, and was witness to the final years when all remaining life ceased to exist. But the Meai, being so powerful, was unable to die, and was doomed to the torment of immortality, forever alone in darkness until it was finally wiped away by the rebirth of the world. The ancient Altiovians believed that the world went through an eternal cycle of birth and death, and at each rebirth the world would change only slightly, but continue to die and be reborn over and over until every possible version of the world had been lived through, only for the cycle to repeat once more in the same way it had done before. Each world cycle would last around 10,000 years. They also believed that there would also be a period of perpetual darkness, in which the world slowly dissolved and was reconstituted into a new form. This period of darkness was the time the Meai was forced by his own immortality to live through, a time that was said to last about 1 million years. The Meai was said to have once been a loving and compassionate being who looked kindly on the world and its inhabitants, who, it was said, used their belief in the Meai to make them come into existence. And in return, the Meai could watch over them and protect them and preserve the life energy so that it could continue to exist from one world cycle to the next. But after 1,000 years or so of loneliness in the dark period, the Meai was driven mad with loneliness and desire for companionship. The Meai could not stand the perpetual darkness and loneliness any longer. They gathered up the remaining life energy of the world, and using his own strength and all his power, he forged a mighty sword that had the power of the unborn world within its blade. The Meai desired to use this sword to cut through time itself and arrive at the beginning of time, to once more live in the world of light and life. He wielded it aloft, and with a mighty strike he cut time in half and pushed his way into the reborn world of light. But the sword was so powerful that even the Meai could not stop its cutting blade. It cut through all of time, leaving a wide, black void. The sword continued to cut until it crushed into the sea of the reborn world, and with the heat of its energy it splashed up drops of steaming water which dotted over the black void and created the shards of light which we now call the stars. Then finally the blade had cut in a full circle and cut clean through the Meai, splitting him into two halves, which became two separate identities, the Dirthion Meai and Agroro Meai. The sword then cut itself in half, before it was finally stopped by its own diminishing power, now halved and broken. Never again would the sword be whole, and have the power to cut through time, though its two halves still remained very powerful, and each of the Meai's halves took one half of the sword for themselves. The Dirthion Meai absorbed his half, becoming stronger, while the Agroro reformed his half into a new sword that could still cut a powerful blow to all time and space. The Dirthion Meai was full of the old Meai's compassion and the love of life, and wished to make the reborn world teeming with new life. The Dirthion shot a flame at one of the stars, which caused its waters to bubble up into a large orb of fire, which then heated up the black void and turned it into a deep ocean in the sky. The Agroro Meai was full of the old Meai's hate and loathing of mortal life, who had the gift of sleeping through the dark period, which he had long had to endure alone. The Agroro had all the old Meai's madness, and in his twisted mind felt that his insanity was good, and wished to go back to the blackness, and make all eternity lifeless and dead. And so the Agroro Meai swung with his new sword, a terrible thunderbolt, at the orb of fire which the Dirthion had created, and turned it cold and lifeless. The sky became black again. The sky ocean simmered back down into the boiling droplets which we now call the stars, and the large orb of fire which the Dirthion had created became the moon. But the Dirthion did not give up hope in giving life to the reborn world, and shot another flame at one of the other stars, which was also turned into a large orb of fire, far greater and hotter than the moon had been. This star became the sun, and was so strong that Agroro could not put out its flame. And so the eternal fight of the Dirthion and Agroro had begun. The Dirthion would fight for life and light, and the Agroro would fight for death and darkness. And so the cycle of day and night came to be. The ancient Altiovians thought that the seasons of the year were dependent on the success of the dark Meai or the light Meai. As the Meai had been brought into existence by their descendants' belief in the Meai, they thought that if they could continue to believe and worship in the Dirthion Meai, this would ensure that they would have long summers and shorten the bitter winters, which they believed was the time that Agroro Meai was gaining the upper hand on the Dirthion. They also regularly worshipped the old Meai too, as they thought that their belief in the Meai created a kind of holy energy, which at some point in the future would accumulate in the sky and create the Meai in its original form. And as a reward, the Meai would watch over them in a future golden age that would last until the end times, where the cycle of the world would start again. And the Meai would once again cut himself into two and enter the reborn world which was created by his sword of power, known to the ancient Altiovians as Meaiunimia, which roughly translates into English the Meai's shaft. This is the most widely known and accepted version of the Altiovian creation myth, which was translated, of course, from the stone tablets found in the library of King Gamot's castle in Demonfield. However, there are several variations of the myth which have arisen from some confusion over what exactly the Meaiunimia was supposed to be. Two theories about the Meaiunimia's name have been suggested by ancient Altiovian scholars over the years. The first one is that originally the Meaiunimia in the ancient Altiovian creation story was in fact a spear rather than a sword, which is why it's known as the Meai's shaft. This theory was first hypothesized by Dr. Lewis Harrison while excavating the Harrison Caves in 1878. He found small fragments of clay pots with ancient Altiovian texts engraved on the side, which spoke of a sacred spear-like object, which he believed to be in reference to the Meaiunimia. He believed that later classical Altiovian chroniclers, who wrote down the earliest known Altiovian texts, changed it to a sword for reasons unknown. This would explain why it's known as the Meai's shaft or stick rather than the Meai's sword in the ancient Altiovian language. Ancient Altiovian scholars believe the creation story to predate Altiov's first sword wielders, which were of course the seafaring Poseidon, who were believed to have arrived on the southern shores of Altiov around 1000 BC. The other theory about the Meaiunimia is that the Meai's shaft refers not to a weapon like a sword or a spear, but rather that it is literally the Meai's shaft, as in a bodily organ of the Meai, which they used not to cut through time, but rather to impregnate the dark void, to tear open a vaginal hole in the dark in order to force it to give birth to the world reborn. Evidence for this version of the story being much closer to what the ancient Altiovians believed comes from stone tablet fragments found in the excavation of the underground city of Altiovian in 1982 by Professor George Baker of the University of New Glasgow. Understandably, this more sexual version of the myth is not widely taught in Altiovian schools due to our modern sensibilities. However, it is now considered by most ancient Altiovian researchers to be the version of the story more closest to what the ancient Altiovians actually believed in. That is the end of the first part of the Altiovian creation myth concerning the Meai and the Meaiunimia. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope you come back for part 2 of the Altiovian creation myth, how Altiov was created. But till then, farewell.